Hi everybody, this is Noelle from Petitti Garden Centers, and we are doing a spotlight on African violets. Now, very much loved, long-lived houseplant, numerous colors, varieties, variegations, all different kinds of things. We're going to talk about how you can be successful with this plant. I wanted to start out with some history because I think it kind of lends to what you should be sort of mimicking indoors for their growing conditions. So in the late 1800s, African violets were discovered by a horticulturist named Baron von Saintpaulia, and henceforth their botanical name is Saintpaulia species, so you might have come across that before. And he did discover them in Africa, actually Eastern Africa, up in the mountains. So if that gives you any idea, they're not necessarily that hot desert type arid plant that we would think of for a lot of plants that, you know, are indigenous to Africa, but these actually do prefer a little bit cooler temperatures and also a little bit more shadier areas. So think about that when you're growing them indoors as houseplants. So always we want to start out with the light conditions and what's right for African violets. Well, it's kind of interesting because indoors you're looking at bright indirect light. They really do not need any direct sunlight on them, okay? So bright indirect light indoors comes through a northern exposure window that's wide open. And the reason being is you're getting wraparound light that is coming into that window. So they can be right up against the northern exposure window. Well, I should say not right up against, because you don't want the cold and things like that and the heat from the glass. The other area that I think they do remarkably well is eastern exposure windows. Again, because the eastern exposure, you're getting morning light that comes in. It's a little bit more delicate, if you will, than a western exposure or a southern exposure, because the light and the heat coming through that window can be so intense. So again, northern window, eastern window. If you don't have a northern exposure and eastern exposure, it's okay. If you have a western exposure or southern exposure, just pull them away from that window and put them kind of in the middle of that room, or let's say like 6 to 8 feet away from that brighter, sunnier window, okay? Or a diffusing curtain, that's always good too. So that's really the light that they like. Now, let's talk about moisture with these. Now, they do like even moisture. They can go slightly dry. And whenever I talk about taking care of houseplants, I always think you should keep them on the drier side of watering. We find many less mistakes, root rot issues, all those types of things. So again, thorough watering with the African violets, and I'll describe that in just a moment. We always do that twice. Moisten the soil substrate, let it drain out, moisten the soil substrate completely one more time, let it drain out, and put the plant back. Now, with African violets, however, they would really like to be watered from the bottom, okay? So they're a perfect plant for this. The reason being, and you're probably familiar, is that their hairy foliage can get marred by cold water droplets. So even if we're really careful and we pull back the foliage and try to find a good spot to water them with a small spout watering can, we still can hit the foliage. And whenever that cold water hits it, guess what? You have a spot. So needless to say, bottom watering works really well for African violets. And many different types of African violet containers help you with this, because the plant typically is planted in the top portion, and then the bottom portion is glazed in this case to hold water. So you simply go ahead and water through the opening, put that water in the base, and let the African violet sit there for maybe about 30 minutes, maybe up to an hour. Let it absorb as much moisture as it needs, and then go ahead and empty it out, okay? So lots of your African violet containers are like this, where there's a 2-part container to them. Or you can simply just fill a plastic saucer or a terracotta saucer or what have you underneath the pot. Go ahead and fill it with water, place your orchid right in the water, let it go ahead and absorb as much as it needs. If it's absorbing it very, very quickly, keep on filling until it stops absorbing, okay? So that's watering in a nutshell for, I just said orchids, didn't I? Oh my gosh, guys, sorry, African violet, sorry. So needless to say, for African violet, so it's always really good to bottom water those. Temperature-wise, they actually like 65 to 70 degrees. That's their perfect temperature. But wherever you're comfortable inside your home, so let's say from the 60-degree mark up to the 80-degree mark, that's fine, okay? But that 65 to 70 is really good. And if you can, adjust your thermostat at night so it drops 5 to 10 degrees, that's actually really, really beneficial for your African violets as well, and orchids too, believe it or not. Okay, so temperature, that was temperature. Now, soil. African violets have very delicate fibrous root systems. They're very, very delicate. So the soil that you want to use is typically an African violet formulation, okay? Now, what you're trying to get here is you're trying to get a very light, fluffy mixture. So a lot of potting mixes, your typical potting mixes, tend to be very light, fluffy, and airy. That's fine. You can use those. You can add a little bit more perlite or vermiculite to increase drainage, and that's a good thing too. But typically your African violet mixes, when you open this up, you see a lot of draining material like the perlite and so forth. So it's going to be a nice, light, fluffy mix. If you come across a mix that is heavy, that is really, really dark, and very, very wet, that is not something you want to plant your African violets in. So avoid any mixtures that you find that are real heavy like that, like topsoil heavy, that kind of thing. Don't use topsoil, okay? So you do want a sterile potting mix. And again, this one's great from Spoma for African violets. Now, with that potting, I do want to mention, and this is kind of crucial, African violets actually like to get potted about every 6 to 12 months. Can you believe that? And you think, oh my gosh, I've been growing my African violet, for years and I've never repotted it. Well, if you haven't had good success with new foliage coming on, new flowering coming on, it might be because they do need some repotting. Don't get me wrong, they like to be pot bound. So for every 12 inches in diameter of your African violet plant, you actually want 1/3 of that measurement as the pot size. So let's say your African violet is 12 inches, like this one is, all the way out to the outside of the leaf. That's great because we have it in a 4-inch container. And that's normally what you see with African violets, okay? The miniature violets, typically, you would really only want them, this is probably 5 inches or so, not even. You probably want them in about a 2-inch or so pot, okay? So keep that in mind. It's about 1/3 of the diameter of the pot. Now, when you're repotting, it doesn't mean you have to put them in a larger pot. That's not the idea here. The idea is for them to actually get root pruned and then produce more roots and new growth. So you're actually potting them right back into the same pot. And typically you would just remove, let's say, 1/4 inch of the root base and then add some new potting soil. Go ahead and put your African violet back down in the pot. And you really want the leaves to just sort of touch, the bottom leaves to kind of touch that lip of the pot, okay? And that's basically your simple repotting. The pots also, I should mention, are typically squat or more shallow. So sometimes you see azalea pots or something like that that are a little bit more shallow than your typical grower's pot. That's also good, again, because African violet roots are very, very shallow and, again, delicate. So that's why you'll see that. Fertilizer, okay. Now, African violets are one of the few flowering houseplants that are capable of blooming throughout the year. 10 months, 11 months, 12 months, they really can produce yearly, and I mean, just keep on going, free blooming, okay? But that requires some fertilizer, obviously, because potting mixes typically don't have nutrients in them. So look for a specific African violet formula, okay, and follow the directions as far as the application. For example, this is Spoma violet formulation. it calls for 2 teaspoons of the fertilizer per 1 quart of water in a watering can, and then you apply it about once every 2 weeks to 4 weeks, okay? Again, I think it's similar when we talk about African violet feeding and orchid feeding. If you can add a little bit of fertilizer to the water and you water weekly, okay, every 7 days, that typically helps, again, kind of flush the nutrients through the soil, makes it available for the plant, and therefore you have that continual blooming. Again, if the plant is wet, okay, or really moist still, obviously hold off on your watering with your fertilizer, but that can help, that continuous fertilization can help with the flowering. Okay, I think just going over the plant material, and we'll look at a little maintenance here. The flowers themselves, if you can deadhead, that's always going to help, because again, it's going to push more energy into the flowering, make sure that that plant is going to continually produce more buds for you. The other thing is, when you look at a violet, it really should only have up to 5 layers of leaves. So sometimes when we get our African violets to grow up, they start growing up and over, and we get these kind of dangly leaves, or kind of strange leaves. We want you and really recommend that you remove those. So lower leaf levels, 1, 2, 3. I have about 3 layers of leaves here on this violet. That's good. You really only want to go up to 5. Now, I want to tell you that blooming always occurs from new growth. That's why you kind of see it always at the top and the middle of the plant here, because they really only develop from new. So that lower leaf stage is not helping you at all. So if you have older leaves, remove them. And that's easy to do. Just go ahead, take some clean scissors. You can use your fingers, of course. Go all the way back to the base of the plant and go ahead and pinch. And you can take that leaf now and you could actually propagate it. So the African violet family is rather unique in that these plants can be propagated from a lot of different parts, including their leaves, which you've probably seen before, but also from their flowering stems and other parts. So needless to say, you would take this leaf, you'd go ahead, you only need about a 1/2 inch of stem, so you'd make a clean cut, okay? I'm just pinching it right now. And then what you could do is you could dip that cut end into a rooting hormone, and then go ahead and put it in a very, very fast draining type soil. So usually like a seed starter or a complete perlite mix or vermiculite mix, that's gonna drain. You're gonna moisten that soil. You're gonna go ahead and put that root hormone dipped leaf into the pot, and then you can tent it. So you can put a clear plastic bag over the top. You could put like a clear plastic cup if you want to as well, and that would work. Now, it takes a while, so in about 3 months, okay, you will start to see new foliage coming from where that cut leaf part was, okay? So deep down in the soil. You'll still see the old leaf, but down closer to the cut end is where all these new little plantlets are coming up. Once they develop a couple of leaves, you can go ahead and separate them out, and then you go ahead and replant your new orchid, okay? So that's a really, really easy way to just kind of increase your orchid family, your African violet family. So sorry guys, African violet, we're talking African violet. Okay, so propagation, soil, light, fertilizer, everything else. I think what you're really looking for is what colors appeal to you. There's almost every color of the rainbow in African violets, except for an orange and except for a black, believe it or not. So bicolors, ruffles, spotted. Some have really unique variegated foliage, frilly foliage. It just kind of depends what you like. And so lots of variety, lots to love with this family. Like I said, very, very long-lived as well. Oh, one more thing. For those of you that have let your African violets grow very, very tall and kind of get floppy, that's what we call a neck, because underneath all that foliage, you kind of get this palm kind of trunk look. that neck actually needs to get buried back down in the soil again, okay? So what you want to do is you don't want your neck to get 2-3 inches long, because ideally what you're doing when you repot is you take 2 to 3 inches of the root base off, push it back down into the pot, add new soil so you're covering the neck, and then the neck will start sprouting roots, okay? So ideally, don't let your neck form past like a 1/2 inch. If you have a 1/2 inch neck, that means when you're repotting, go ahead and take a 1/2 inch off the root ball, go ahead and put it back down in the pot, refill with the soil, and then again, your foliage crown should be sitting right at the lip. And there you go, you take care of that neck issue if you've ever seen that before as well. Okay, I think that's all for African violets. Enjoy.